I'm a 35-year-old woman, and I've always been fine with how my life is. I don't have kids, never wanted them, and I'm financially independent. My job keeps me busy, and I enjoy traveling and having the freedom to live my life on my terms. But if you were at my family's annual reunion last weekend, you'd think I was some kind of villain for not popping out a baby or dedicating my life to chasing after one. Family reunions are supposed to be fun, right? A time to catch up with relatives, eat way too much food, and maybe laugh over embarrassing childhood stories. Well, mine is more like an endurance test. The moment I stepped into the house, I could feel the tension. The subtle glances exchanged between aunts, the too wide smiles, and the loaded questions. It was all there. I barely had time to hang up my coat before someone made the first jab. "You're still single, huh?" My cousin Patricia said, loud enough for the whole room to hear. Patricia, who has 3 kids and posts about them nonstop on social media, was holding court in the kitchen, showing off her youngest's latest school photos. Must be nice to have all that free time. What do you even do with yourself? I smiled politely and shrugged it off because what's the point of engaging? But it didn't stop there. Another cousin chimed in, talking about how their lives really started after having kids. Then someone else asked, "Have you ever considered adoption?" I mean, it's not too late, but it's harder when you're older. It was like they'd rehearsed this routine, a coordinated ambush designed to make me feel small. They'd say it all with fake sweetness, like they were trying to help. But the judgment was as clear as the lemonade on the table. Even my mom got in on it, casually mentioning that I was wasting my best years, and how every woman should experience the joy of motherhood. My dad nodded along, throwing in a comment about how they would have loved more grandkids. I tried to deflect, mentioning my career milestones and hobbies, but it didn't matter. My accomplishments never held any weight here. The only currency they valued was diapers, report cards, and family Christmas photos. At some point, the topic shifted to my younger sister, Laura. Growing up, she was the golden child. Beautiful, charming, and always the center of attention. If there was a spotlight, Laura was in it. But things changed when she got pregnant at 21, dropped out of college, and got involved with the wrong crowd. Addiction followed, along with a series of bad decisions. Eventually, she disappeared from our lives altogether. The last time I saw her was years ago, at some court-mandated family therapy session that ended with her storming out. No one had heard from her since. When Laura's name came up, the room got quieter. It was like everyone collectively decided not to dwell on it for too long. My aunt mentioned, almost offhandedly, that Laura's son, Jamie, was in foster care now. She said it like she was talking about the weather, detached, casual, and with zero emotion. I froze for a moment trying to process what I'd just heard. Jamie. I'd never met him, but I knew he was about 10 years old now. The last I'd heard, he was living with Laura and one of her boyfriends. Apparently that didn't last. "What do you mean he's in foster care?" I asked. My aunt shrugged. "Well, you know how Laura is. Her choices caught up with her. Poor kid. But what can you do?" I looked around the room, waiting for someone to say something. Anything. But they all just went back to their conversations. It was like Jamie didn't even exist. I pressed my parents about it, but they waved me off. "You wouldn't understand," my mom said. It's not that simple. The rest of the evening was a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about Jamie, a 10-year-old boy abandoned by his mother and dismissed by the very people who should have been there for him. And here they were, lecturing me about responsibility and family values. When I got home that night, I couldn't let it go. I started digging, trying to find out what I could about Jamie. It didn't take long to find some information. He'd been in the system for a while, bouncing between homes. The more I read, the angrier I got. How could my family just pretend he didn't exist? How could they sit around, judging me, while turning their backs on a child who needed them? The next morning, I called a social worker to ask about Jamie's situation. It wasn't a decision I made lightly. I knew it was going to be complicated and messy, but I couldn't stand the idea of him being forgotten. If my family wouldn't step up, then maybe I could. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone. It wasn't about silencing their judgment or making myself feel better. It was about Jamie, a kid who deserved more than the hand he'd been dealt, and I wasn't going to let him slip through the cracks. Update 1. I spent the next day making calls, trying to figure out how to meet Jamie. The social worker I spoke with told me Jamie had been in foster care for a few years. He'd been shuffled between homes, and apparently he had what they referred to as behavioral issues. When I asked what that meant, she mentioned difficulty adjusting, acting out, and struggling in school. It didn't surprise me. How could a kid go through what he had and not have some scars? The social worker was cautious about letting me visit him. She explained that Jamie had trust issues, and meeting new people could be overwhelming for him. But after hearing that I was a family member, though barely a blip in Jamie's life, she agreed to arrange a supervised visit. She warned me to manage my expectations. A week later, I showed up at the foster care center for the meeting. My palms were sweaty, and I kept adjusting my bag strap. I wasn't sure what I was walking into. The social worker led me to a small room with mismatched furniture and bright, peeling paint. Jamie was sitting at a table, drawing on a piece of paper. His hair was shaggy, and he looked much smaller than I expected for a 10-year-old. He didn't look up when I walked in. I sat across from him, unsure of what to say. The social worker introduced me and said I was his aunt. Jamie glanced at me briefly, then went back to his drawing. His shoulders were hunched, and he gripped the pencil tightly. I didn't want to push him, so I just commented on his drawing. He was sketching a robot, detailed and precise. When I complimented it, he mumbled a quick thanks but didn't stop working. The first meeting was quiet and awkward, but I felt a pull toward him. I couldn't explain it. He didn't trust me. Why would he? But I knew I wanted to come back. When I told my family about the visit, it went about as well as you'd expect. My mom rolled her eyes and said I was being dramatic. My dad scoffed and said I was playing hero. My cousins laughed and joked about how I was going to regret it. It stung, but it didn't matter. I wasn't doing this for them. Over the next few weeks, I visited Jamie a few more times. He was always cautious, but he started to open up. I brought him a sketchbook on one visit, and his face lit up for the first time. He loved to draw robots, spaceships, and superheroes. He was good at it, too. I asked him about his favorite movies, and he rattled off a list of animated ones. I made a mental note to watch them later so I'd have something to talk to him about. Bit by bit, he started sharing small pieces of his life. He told me about his mom, how she used to sing to him when he was little, how she smelled like strawberries, and how she stopped showing up when he needed her most. It was heartbreaking to hear, but I didn't interrupt. I let him talk. By the time I decided to start the adoption process, I had no illusions about how hard it was going to be. The paperwork alone was overwhelming, and the system was designed to weed out anyone who wasn't 100% committed. Some of my friends were supportive, but a few raised eyebrows. They reminded me that Jamie came with baggage and asked if I was ready for the responsibility. It didn't change my mind, but it did make me think about how unprepared I felt. My parents were furious when they found out. They accused me of embarrassing the family and bringing more shame onto them. My mom even said I was stealing Laura's child. It was laughable, considering how they'd washed their hands of him. After one too many arguments, I stopped answering their calls. Thankfully, not everyone was against me. A couple of close friends helped me set up Jamie's room. We painted the walls a soft blue, put up shelves for his sketchbooks, and added a small desk for him to draw. I wanted him to feel like he had a space that was his, even if he wasn't living with me yet. During one visit, Jamie told me he'd been bullied in foster care. The other kids teased him for not having a real family. I could see how much it hurt him, even though he tried to act like it didn't. I promised myself I would change that. He deserved to feel safe and wanted. The process hit a snag when the agency asked for family references. My parents refused to vouch for me, saying I wasn't fit to raise a child. It felt like a punch to the gut, but I didn't let it stop me. I found coworkers and friends who were more than willing to back me up. Eventually, Jamie came for his first sleepover at my house. He was nervous, and so was I. We tried making pancakes for dinner, but it turned into a disaster. The batter ended up everywhere except the pan, and we laughed so hard that we both had tears streaming down our faces. It was the first time I saw him let his guard down completely. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked if he could come back again. I told him he was always welcome. It wasn't perfect, and I knew there were more challenges ahead, but in that moment, it felt like we were on the right path. Update 2. The adoption process started moving faster than I expected. The first big hurdle was the home inspection. The social worker called to schedule it, and suddenly everything in my house felt inadequate. I spent the week before her visit childproofing every corner. I bought outlet covers, rearranged furniture, and stocked the fridge with kid-friendly snacks. A friend helped me assemble a secondhand bookshelf for Jamie's room, which he'd already started decorating with his drawings. On inspection day, I was a nervous wreck, but the social worker didn't seem overly critical. She walked through the house with a clipboard, checking off items on her list. When she reached Jamie's room, she smiled at the sketchbooks lined up neatly on his desk. "He's going to feel at home here," she said. It was the first moment I felt like I might actually pull this off. Then came the financial strain. I didn't realize how expensive the adoption process could get. There were application fees, legal costs, and the unexpected expenses of setting up Jamie's space. Every time I looked at my bank account, I felt a pit in my stomach, but giving up wasn't an option. I cut back on unnecessary expenses, skipping out on things like takeout and my gym membership, and focused every spare dollar on getting through the next step. A few weeks later, I got a call that the custody hearing was scheduled. I'd need to provide proof that I could care for Jamie long-term. That meant gathering financial statements, employment records, and personal references. The social worker reassured me that I was on the right track, but it was still overwhelming. During one of Jamie's visits, he started calling me Aunt Name instead of just using my name. It caught me off guard, but I didn't correct him. He also asked if he could put up some glow-in-the-dark stars on the ceiling of his room. We spent the afternoon sticking them up together, and later, when we turned off the lights, his smile lit up the entire room. But the next blow came from my parents. I learned they'd written a letter to the court stating I was unfit to adopt Jamie. They called me selfish and claimed I lacked the experience to raise a child. The letter was brutal. I hadn't expected their support, but actively sabotaging me? That felt like a new low. I hired a lawyer to counter their claims and started gathering testimonials from friends and coworkers who could vouch for my character. One of my colleagues wrote about how I'd helped her through a tough time with her kids, and a neighbor mentioned how I'd always been reliable and caring. The letters gave me hope, but it was hard not to think about how my own parents were actively trying to block me from helping Jamie. Meanwhile, Jamie started opening up more during our visits. One afternoon, he told me he'd always felt like he didn't belong anywhere. He said foster care felt like being passed around, like nobody wanted to keep him. Hearing that made me more determined to give him a permanent home. For the first time, he talked about things he wanted to do in the future, like becoming an artist or visiting a big city. It felt like a breakthrough. As Jamie's birthday approached, I learned from the social worker that he'd never had a real birthday party. I decided to throw one. I invited a few of his foster siblings, as well as some kids he'd recently met at school. We kept it simple: pizza, cake, and a small art station where the kids could draw. When Jamie walked into the living room and saw the decorations, his eyes widened. He'd never been celebrated like that before. At the end of the party, Jamie hugged me and called me mom for the first time. I didn't react outwardly, but it hit me hard. It wasn't something I expected or even thought about, but hearing it felt right. The custody hearing was the final hurdle. On the day of the hearing, a distant cousin I hadn't spoken to in years showed up unexpectedly. She told the court how ashamed she was of the family for abandoning Jamie and how much she admired what I was doing. Her testimony was unexpected but powerful. Jamie also spoke during the hearing. He told the judge he felt safe with me and that he wanted to stay. His voice shook a little, but he got through it. By the end of the hearing, the judge ruled in our favor. I was granted custody and Jamie officially became part of my family. It was a bittersweet victory. I knew my parents and most of the family would never support me, but I realized I didn't need their approval. What mattered was Jamie and the life we were starting together. That night, after the hearing, Jamie moved in permanently. We made spaghetti for dinner, and while it wasn't perfect, we laughed through the mishaps, just like we had during his first sleepover. Later, we started a scrapbook to document his journey, our journey. As I looked at the first page, filled with his drawings and photos from his birthday, I felt like we were finally building something real. The next morning, I blocked my family's numbers. It wasn't out of anger, but because I needed to focus on Jamie and our future. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were heading in the right direction. Update 3. Jamie moving in permanently was the start of a new chapter, but it wasn't without its bumps. At first, the biggest challenge was structure. He wasn't used to having rules. Things like doing homework before playing video games, or putting his dishes in the sink felt foreign to him. There were a few arguments and some slammed doors, but I stayed consistent, and over time, he started adjusting. Mornings were the toughest. Jamie hated waking up early for school, and he'd drag his feet until we were both rushing out the door. But by the end of the first month, we had a system. I'd pack his lunch while he got dressed, and we'd share a quick breakfast before heading out. It wasn't perfect, but it worked. At school, Jamie struggled with math. His teacher sent home notes about incomplete assignments and low test scores, but she also mentioned his talent for art. One afternoon, Jamie brought home a crumpled drawing he'd done in class, a vibrant sketch of a futuristic city. It was incredible. I decided to enroll him in a weekend art class at the local community center, and he was thrilled. Seeing him excited about something gave me hope that we were on the right path. The community around us stepped up in ways I didn't expect. A neighbor down the street, an older woman named Mrs. Green, stopped by one day with a batch of cookies for Jamie. She told me she'd heard about his story and wanted to make him feel welcome. Over the next few weeks, other neighbors introduced themselves, offering help or just stopping to say hi when they saw us outside. Jamie even made friends with a boy his age who lived 2 houses over. They bonded over a shared love of video games and spent afternoons riding bikes around the neighborhood. For spring break, I planned a road trip. Jamie had never seen the ocean, so I decided to take him to the coast. The drive was long, but we passed the time singing along to the radio and playing I Spy. When we finally arrived, Jamie ran straight to the water, shoes and all, and laughed as the waves splashed over his feet. It was the happiest I'd seen him. We spent the weekend building sandcastles, collecting seashells, and eating way too much ice cream. On the way home, he fell asleep in the car, clutching a souvenir seashell he'd found. Back at school, Jamie's art teacher asked if she could feature one of his drawings in a school exhibition. Jamie was nervous about it at first, but when the night of the exhibition came, he was beaming with pride. His drawing, a detailed portrait of a robot, was displayed prominently and parents and students stopped to admire it. Seeing people appreciate his talent boosted his confidence, and I couldn't have been prouder. Things took a turn when I got a message from Laura. It was the first time I'd heard from her in years. She wanted to see Jamie. I didn't know how to handle it, so I sat Jamie down and told him about the message. I made it clear that the decision was his. He hesitated but eventually agreed to meet her. The reunion was tense. We met at a park, with me sitting nearby while Jamie and Laura talked. Jamie was polite but guarded, and Laura seemed unsure of how to connect with him. She apologized for not being there, but Jamie didn't say much. After an hour, he came back to sit with me, saying he was ready to leave. It was clear that he wasn't ready for a relationship with her, and I made it clear to Laura that Jamie's well-being came first. She nodded and left without argument. Not long after, Jamie had another big win at school. He entered a district-wide art competition and earned an award for his work. The school held a small ceremony and Jamie's name was called. He walked up to accept his award and the entire room clapped for him. That night, we celebrated with a movie and popcorn, laughing and quoting lines back and forth. It felt like we were finally finding our rhythm as a family. Out of nowhere, one of my cousins reached out to apologize for the way they'd treated me. They admitted they'd been wrong to judge me and said they admired what I'd done for Jamie. I accepted the apology but kept my guard up. Too much damage had been done for me to trust them fully, and I wasn't about to let anyone disrupt the peace Jamie and I had found. The rest of the family, of course, continued to gossip. I'd hear bits and pieces from mutual acquaintances, claims that I'd stolen Jamie from Laura, or that I was trying to make myself look good. It didn't bother me anymore. Jamie's happiness was my priority, and the rest didn't matter. One evening, as we were putting up decorations for a new holiday tradition we'd started, Art Night Fridays, where we'd create something together, Jamie looked up at me and said, "This feels like home now." Hearing that made all the challenges worth it. As we sat down to start painting, I realized we weren't just surviving anymore. We were thriving, building something strong and beautiful together. Jamie wasn't just healing, he was growing, and so was I. Together, we were creating a future that felt like ours. Update 4. Life with Jamie continued to evolve, but it wasn't without its challenges. The first real hurdle came when Jamie started falling behind in school. His teacher called me in for a meeting, pointing out that he struggled to focus in class. Homework was either incomplete or rushed, and he'd gotten frustrated during tests, leaving some blank. At home, the frustration spilled over into a few tense moments. He slammed doors and stomped off when things didn't go his way. And I knew it wasn't just about the schoolwork. There was more going on under the surface. One evening, Jamie admitted that some kids at school had been teasing him. They'd found out he was adopted and had started calling him names like nobody's kid. I could see how much it bothered him, even though he tried to shrug it off. Instead of dwelling on the hurt, I suggested we channel those feelings into something productive. Jamie reluctantly agreed to work on a new drawing, and what he came up with blew me away. It was a detailed, emotional piece of a lone tree in a storm, its roots gripping the earth tightly. I decided to enter it into a local art competition. Jamie's drawing won second place, and he finally started to see how much his talent could do for him. Around the same time, Laura began contacting me more frequently. Her messages started innocently enough, asking how Jamie was doing, if he was eating well, or if he was happy. but they soon escalated into demands to see him regularly. I didn't want to cut her off completely, so I encouraged Jamie to decide what he was comfortable with. After a few hesitant calls, he told me he wasn't ready for more visits. I relayed his decision to Laura, but she didn't take it well. The calls from her became more persistent, and I realized I needed to set firmer boundaries. The rest of the family, of course, found out. They accused me of overstepping my place and trying to erase Laura from Jamie's life. The gossip reached a boiling point when I ran into my mother at the grocery store. She barely looked at me before saying I'd ruined everything by adopting Jamie. Her tone was icy, and it was clear there was no changing her mind. I didn't argue, I just walked away. After that, I contacted my lawyer to draft a legal letter ensuring Laura's involvement would be limited unless supervised by a third party. I wasn't taking any chances with Jamie's well-being. Back at school, Jamie's struggles were still a concern. I met with his teacher and the principal to come up with a plan. They suggested extra tutoring and more one-on-one time with his teacher during breaks. I also made sure to reinforce positive habits at home, no screens until homework was done, and a set bedtime to help him focus during the day. Slowly, Jamie began to find his footing. He even made 2 new friends at school, one of whom loved drawing as much as he did. They spent hours sketching together, trading ideas and showing off their work. One evening, after a particularly rough day, Jamie came into the kitchen while I was cooking dinner. He stood there for a moment before asking, "You're not going to get rid of me, right? Like my mom did?" The question broke my heart. I stopped what I was doing, knelt to his level, and told him he was my family forever, no matter what. He nodded, but I could tell it would take time for him to fully believe it. A few days later, a letter arrived from my parents. It was long and scathing, blaming me for tearing the family apart. They demanded that I make amends and claimed I'd caused irreparable damage. I didn't reply. I wasn't about to let their negativity take up space in the life Jamie and I were building. To give Jamie a sense of ownership and security, I decided to convert part of the basement into an art studio. We painted the walls together and set up shelves for his supplies. He chose a bright red desk as the centerpiece, and I added a corkboard for him to pin his favorite pieces. When it was done, Jamie beamed. He spent hours down there, sketching and experimenting with new ideas. It became his safe space. There were also small victories along the way. Jamie came home from school one day, waving a spelling test with a perfect score. We celebrated with his favorite dinner, mac and cheese with hot dogs, and spent the evening playing board games. It was one of those nights where everything felt easy and right. As I looked at the progress Jamie was making, I realized we both had a lot of healing to do, but we were doing it together, step by step. My focus shifted toward helping him build confidence and independence. He wasn't just my responsibility, he was my family, and together we were creating something that felt solid, something that would last. For the first time in a long time, it felt like the storm was clearing. Jamie had his roots, and so did I. Update 5. Jamie's art teacher came to me one afternoon with exciting news. She had submitted one of Jamie's drawings to a regional contest without telling him, and it had won first place. The contest organizers wanted to feature his work at a school-wide assembly and present him with an award. When I told Jamie, his face lit up with a mix of pride and nervousness. The thought of standing in front of his classmates terrified him, but I reassured him he didn't have to say much, just accept the award and smile. On the day of the assembly, Jamie dressed up in a collared shirt, fidgeting nervously with the cuffs. When his name was called, the crowd erupted in applause. He walked up to the stage, clutching the microphone awkwardly. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice shaky but clear. "Art helps me say things I don't know how to say out loud," he told the room. "It makes me feel like I'm not alone." By the time he stepped off the stage, the applause had turned into a standing ovation. But the moment wasn't without its complications. After the ceremony, as we were taking photos with his art teacher, Laura showed up unannounced. I spotted her lingering near the back of the crowd, looking hesitant. When Jamie noticed her, his expression shifted from excitement to confusion. Laura approached cautiously, but her presence created tension. She started talking to Jamie, but her words quickly turned into a defensive tirade about how she'd been trying to reach him and how I was keeping him from her. Jamie froze, unsure of how to respond. I stepped in and calmly told Laura this wasn't the time or place. Her voice grew louder, drawing the attention of nearby parents and teachers. I firmly asked her to leave, and eventually she stormed off, muttering under her breath. Jamie's excitement from the ceremony was dampened, but we managed to salvage the day with ice cream and a quiet evening at home. I knew I needed to set firmer boundaries, so I reached out to my lawyer to ensure Laura couldn't disrupt Jamie's life again, without consequences. A few days later, Jamie was unpacking a box of old belongings I'd stored in the basement when he found a small photo album. It was filled with pictures of him as a baby and a toddler, most of them with Laura. He brought the album to me, flipping through the pages. We sat together, looking at the photos, and I answered his questions as best as I could. It was a bittersweet moment, but it gave Jamie a chance to process his past in a safe environment. Meanwhile, the family drama didn't slow down. My extended relatives had taken to social media, accusing me of stealing Jamie from Laura and spreading false stories about how I'd manipulated the system. The posts were harsh and full of lies, but I ignored them. I didn't need their validation, and I wasn't about to let their toxicity affect Jamie. Unexpectedly, Anna, the cousin who had supported me during the custody hearing, reached out. She had seen the posts and wanted to publicly defend me. She wrote a heartfelt post of her own, calling out the family's hypocrisy and praising me for stepping up when no one else would. Her words carried weight, and the tide of public opinion shifted slightly in my favor. At school, Jamie's principal called me to commend his progress. He told me Jamie had become a role model for other kids, especially those who struggled with confidence. Hearing that filled me with pride. Jamie's transformation was visible in everything he did. His art was even displayed at a local gallery's youth showcase, where community members stopped to admire his work. Seeing Jamie stand beside his drawings, confidently answering questions about his process, was one of the happiest moments of my life. One night, as we were cleaning up after dinner, Jamie looked at me and said, "You're the best thing that's ever happened to me." The words caught me off guard, and I had to turn away for a moment to compose myself. Moments like that made every struggle worth it. The family wasn't done though. My mother showed up at my door one afternoon, trying to guilt me into forgiving them. She claimed the family was falling apart because of me, and that I needed to fix things. I stood firm, telling her that my priority was Jamie and his well-being. She left angry, but I didn't waver. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Laura. It was surprisingly heartfelt. She admitted her mistakes, apologized to Jamie, and promised to work on herself before trying to be a part of his life again. I showed the letter to Jamie, and we decided to keep it for when he was ready to process it. The final confrontation with my family came at a wedding. I attended with Jamie, and as expected, the whispers and side eyes started immediately. At one point, a relative made a snide comment about my charity project. I'd had enough. I stood up and calmly called out their hypocrisy, reminding them of all the times they'd ignored Jamie when he needed help. Then I took Jamie's hand, and we left. Jamie's confidence continued to grow. He started researching high schools with strong art programs and talked excitedly about his future. To celebrate his achievements, we began creating a scrapbook of his journey, our journey. As we glued photos and drawings onto the pages, it felt like we were closing the door on the past and stepping into a new chapter together. Our bond was unbreakable, and for the first time, everything felt exactly as it should.